Session of the day. Thank you so much for following along, and like I've said earlier, I hope you've enjoyed the conference so far. Today we're going to talk about extensibility, and when referring to team system, extensibility is actually a very important thing. The tool was designed to connect to multiple systems, and it was really designed to be extensible and customizable. For example, if you purchase most Microsoft products, like Word, you can launch it and use it. Team System isn't like that. If you use Team System out of the box, you won't get that much value out of it. You will get some value, but not as much as you can if you customize the process and customize the look and feel of the product. So there's been a whole industry created around this. And in fact, I used to be a team system consultant who would go into companies and help customize and integrate team system with different environments. And one example is this large grocery company, this corporation in Canada. They had a Java infrastructure and a .NET infrastructure, and they wanted to integrate the two together. So it was my job to use Team Foundation Server to integrate these two infrastructures. When the Java team launched a build, it would trigger a custom build task, which would allow the Java to build on and for the monitoring to occur. .NET would build through MS Build. All of the work item tracking was unified across both teams. All of the testing was unified across teams using generic testing. So it was a very interesting case study, and it was a great project to work on, and just really showed that whole customization story and extensibility between those two. So the first thing I'm going to cover is essentially, if you take a look at Team System, as you can see, extensibility is actually a really huge piece of it. And there's a difference between customization and extensibility. So customization is really that tailoring of the environment. And extensibility goes even further, and it's adding new functionality to the product. And as you can see here, the extensibility part is actually more tailored to people who develop software as a living. So it wouldn't be uncommon if you have several developers within a development company to have them work on extensibility projects within your companies, of course. And in most development companies I've worked with, there's always custom tools being built in-house, and this would be part of that process. So if we take a look at the customizations that are available within Team System, there's process guidance, and this is MSF and some of the other types of guidance that are out there. There's tools on Codeplex which will allow you to generate your own guidance. There's work item types. Now, within most projects, there's usually a task, a scenario, issues, and risk. Just to explain the usage of some of these work items. So, task, very clear. Bug, very clear. A scenario is an aggregation of different tasks to complete a greater task. Risks are really interesting. You can use a risk in order to implement process improvement in your project. You can use a risk as an element at the beginning of the project to ascertain all of the different elements which may cause problems in your project. For example, if you're developing a mobile application and the device that you're targeting is not yet released, but you expect it to be released, you have to create a risk mitigation for that. What if the product's not released? What will you do? How will you test the application and make sure that it gets released on time? So you can ascertain all this, do this risk assessment at the beginning. Risk can also be used during the course of your project. So as you're running through different scenarios, you may encounter situations which put your project at risk and actually cause your project to be delayed. I'll give you a good example. Let's say you have a small team and one of the members actually breaks his leg. Then in that process, you could measure and document that risk. And then, in using that risk, you can create risk mitigations at the end when you're doing the milestone and when you're tracking all the progress of your project at the very end, and ascertain that perhaps you need to hire another employee who will be able to jump in if such a thing happens. So there may be certain work types like risks and so forth that are very particular to your own company, and that's where work item types you can create your own. And I'll show you very soon a template based on Scrum. And Scrum has a whole different range of different work items. Scrum has stories instead of scenarios. Scrum has sprints where you're actually running through a process, an iteration of different tasks. And instead of use cases and tasks, actually you have these little file cards that you typically use to track the activities that you want to run through. Version control has a lot of extensibility too. The first part of it is those policies that you can apply to version control whenever you run through a build or you're trying to check in code. Another one is, version control can be customized so that you only get a single person checking in at once, or you can have multiple people check in within a project. In terms of reporting, you can create your own reports using SQL Server reporting services. And this requires a knowledge of OLAP. And it is relatively simple once you understand how the cube is configured, and you can bring in information from work items and from builds and correlate those two. Then finally, there's a project portal. And if you take a look at the project portal once you produce a project, you'll notice that it's pretty vanilla. It looks like a SharePoint portal. And so using several tools, you could use Front Page to customize the look and feel of the portal to make it look like the way it should for your company or the company you're working with the logo and with the colors and so forth. There's also another tool that came out called SharePoint Designer, which will allow you to do this. There's been a lot of interest in connecting existing SharePoint projects to team system projects, and that's yet another thing that you can do with Team System 2008. There are specific instructions which tell you exactly how to do that connection and reuse your assets to do that. So in terms of customizing the process guidance, as I mentioned before, you go on CodePlex, you download the tool, and you can incorporate these word templates and so forth. And within the XML files, you can designate those different elements, the roles in your team. You can designate the different items that correlate to those roles. And automatically, once you run the tool, it will generate all the HTML to produce your guidance. So if you go in CodePlex, you can look at the instructions, you can create your own guidance that way. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you a brand new tool. The tool came out around the time of Visual Studio 2018 system. And it was a tool that was designed by a friend of mine in Canada named Joel Semeniuk. And he works for a company called Imaginets, and out of passion for Team System, he created a process template editor. So first, let me show you what a process template looks like without an editor, and how the editor looks like within Team System. Now, it's important to note that the editor isn't included in Team System. It's actually included in a separate download called the Team Foundation Power Tools. So let me go into the demo environment and show you some of these things. So you'll notice on my desktop, I have a process template for Scrum 2.1. And within that process template, I have a process template.xml file, classifications, groups and permissions, reports, work item tracking, the SharePoint services, and version control. So what I'll do is I'm going to open up the process template using WordPad. So what it does is it defines the different parts of your process. You have your classification, reporting, portals, groups, work item tracking, and version control. So what I'll do first is launch my Zoom It tool. So I can zoom into my process template. There we go. So as you notice, these different wizards will launch. And the use of the wizards are when you actually create a new instance of a process within Team System, these different wizards will activate and create the SharePoint portal, create a whole version control tree for you, create all of your work item types, and so forth. And then you'll notice that it then classifies these different XML files which will represent these different artifacts in your process. One thing I could do now is go into work item tracking. You'll notice that I have queries and type definitions. If we go into the queries, and I open up one of these queries, you'll notice that, whoops, hold on a second. I'll open one up using the notepad and you'll see exactly what I mean. So you'll notice that the query actually is written out much like a T-SQL query, where you have a fragment of XML, and then you do a select statement, which pulls the data out of the data repository. If we take a look at the work item, I'm going to pick the type definitions that are available within Scrum, and you'll notice that for a defect, I'll open this up in Notepad again. So we have different constraints on the different fields within our work item. And then the transition. So if you remember earlier in one of my presentations, I explained how a task work item could either be open or closed, depending on whether you completed the work or whether the work is outstanding. And this is where you define in XML those different transactions. And then finally, if you scroll way down, you have actually within here, there is a description of the layout of your work item. So what I'll do is, rather than work using XML, which isn't very fun, I'm going to open up Visual Studio 2008 and use the process template editor to work with this process template. So I'm going to select Process Editor, Open Process Template, and select that XML file. And in a few moments, it's going to load the template, and you're going to notice that it's completely a visual environment, which makes it a lot easier to use. So what we have here is the creation of a portal and version control and some default work items. So we have a set of backlog items that were created, and you'll notice that these backlog items also have custom descriptions to them. We also have work item type definitions. And so we have the different fields that we can work with. We can define the layout of the control. And we could also preview what it will look like. And everything's written up hierarchically. And then we can define the workflow. So it actually uses some of the workflow functionality in .NET to display some of this information. So as you can see, it's a much easier way of representing a work item. So if we take a look at iterations, we have iteration 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. And again, the representation of those iterations is very unique to Sprint, to Scrum, and provides value. So in terms of customizing work item types, you can customize the out-of-the-box methodologies. So if you don't like the different transitions, you can set up your own transitions. You could also define your own form layouts. And so a good scenario for this is in case you want to capture some extra data. For example, if you have a certain way of tracking or estimating on a work item, you can add a field which can be used to calculate and to be reported on. And this field can be added anywhere within your form using this tool. Another thing you can do is customize version control, and this is very specifically setting up those custom policies. And the example I used before is a custom policy which will check your code to make sure you have you've added comments to your code in order to make it more maintainable. So what I'm going to show you is an example of how you can build your own custom policies yourself. I'm going to go back into my development environment, and I'm going to navigate into a folder where all my custom policies are located to begin with. So you go to Program Files. I'm going to go to Visual Studio 9 in this case, Team Tools, Static Analysis Tools, FX Cop, then Rules. So here you'll notice that we have all the default rules, including design rules, maintainability, globalization, and so forth. So whenever you create a new rule or a rule set, this is where you would place the DLL that you're creating. So what I'll do is open up a custom FX Cop rule and walk you through some of the architecture of that rule. Now, as you can see, this is how the rules are maintained and shown while you're debugging an application. And the very same rules can be applied to build and to check-ins. So the first thing you need to do is create a rules.xml file. And this rules.xml will provide the friendly name for the rule. And in this case, it's BorderCal custom rules. You provide your type name, so whatever type you've defined within your code. The name, the fix category, so if there are non-breaking fixes, then you can set this. If it's a breaking fix, if this rule will actually cause your code to break, then you can change this. You can set the warning level as high or as low as you want. So is it just a warning? Is it an error that you want this rule to raise? Then you have resolution, description, and so forth. So once you've created your rule, then we can take a look at some of the code behind the rule. So I'm going to open up the inspection rule. And the first thing we need to do is to add a couple of namespaces. So the first namespace is this Microsoft.fxcop.sdk introspection. And what this will allow you to do is to inspect your own code. And using the CCI, this will provide the functionality of being able to instantiate the custom rule using FXCop. So what I've done is I've set up a class called introspection rule, which uses that introspection class using reflection in order to look at the structure or the content of the source code. And then what I can do is to use this attribute called system.diagnostic.codeanalysis suppress message in order to set up the specific message for that rule. And the justification for the rule is that the protected constructor is called from the subclasses. And the actual implementation of the rule is contained right here in this folder. So let me show you this. So in the structure of an FXCOP rule, you set the usage within this folder, and you can also add some documentation for your rule. So we'll take a look at the documentation for a second. As you can see, it will tell you exactly what the resolution of that specific issue, and will tell you the cause. So essentially, you raise a rule violation using the suppress message attribute. So when you set up your project, you can suppress the violations. But if this rule runs, it will warn you that the user has suppressed the messages. So this is very useful if one of your developers are very lazy and they don't want to see the rules come up, but you want to double check that their rules are actually running, right? So this is essentially a cop rule, a police rule. So here's how it was implemented. First, you have to add the Microsoft.fxcop SDK. And then we have certain methods which will check the existence of the override. So first we pick up the collection of different types of checks. And then we can verify the attribute of the project. So if the justification is empty, then what it does is it sets a flag to be either true or false. So then it can go through the list of different arguments for that justification and provide a return value as a literal. That return value will then get processed by FXCOP and then render the rule as being satisfied or not satisfied. So if you're interested in writing code analysis rules, there's actually a lot of documentation that's available on CodePlex, and the FXCOP team is constantly releasing new SDKs of FXCOP. So I would highly recommend that you check out those resources if you're interested in this topic. So Team System has not only customization of process templates and of guidance and also rules, but also a core object model based on web services. So you can query Team Foundation Server for several things, including the status of the server, security model. You can query the state of the build server. You can query the version control and so forth. So the list of core assemblies that you would use to create these extensibility points is found at the link, or rather at the path listed below. And I explained a little bit how you would set up a version control check-in policy. The one thing I didn't indicate is that you can derive a class from policy base to also create that rule. The work item object model is also a very important concept. You can get, so this is really important if you want a work item to complete a scenario, for example. So let's say you wanted to measure, or you wanted a work item to trigger a certain event. So currently, when you complete a work item, it just simply completes. But you can imagine a work item completing and perhaps running a build. or a work item completing and checking in some code in version control, or launching the production of a report. So, or sending email. There's a lot of different scenarios where this can come into play. And let me show you in the team system environment where some of these things are. So I'm going to move into my Team Explorer. And it's going to connect to, say, my healthcare project. So if I right-click here and I go to Team Project Settings, you'll notice that I have a number of different options, including errors and iterations. And if I go here on the top line, I can do a number of different things, including the Process Template Manager. So just to cover some of the things I did before, the Process Template Manager is the way you can pull down processes or push up your custom processes onto the server. If you go specifically into a project, you can set project alerts. So you'll notice here that you can set up alert once work items are changed by others and have an email sent to somebody. So, for example, if your developers are working on a specific task and somebody else has closed that task for whatever reason, it's a good way of getting that checksum occurring. If anything's checked in or so forth, but you can create your own customized project alerts using the work item extensibility model. So the last thing I'll cover, and I'm not going to keep you here too long, is the event system. So Team Foundation Server has a really great eventing system, and it's something you can subscribe to. So the eventing system is called bis-subscribe.exe. So essentially, whenever an event occurs, be it a check-in, build, it could be any other type of event which is measured in Team Foundation Server. You could subscribe to that and call a web service which will run whatever process you want. And in fact, this has been improved a great deal in 2008 with the inclusion of workflows. So you could have an event happen in Team Foundation Server and trigger an entire workflow of work within the server. The event subscription is persistent, so there's a couple of delivery ways of using email or SOAP, but the web services is pretty much the most commonly used one. And you can filter the expressions to that. So that's pretty much all the content I have for this session. The main call to action, I would say, is to download the Team Foundation Power Tools. There's a lot of really good samples in there that would provide a lot of value in the building of your content. And be sure to check out the sessions tomorrow. I'm going to have some labs ready for you, so you can just download the labs, and if you get a copy of Team System on your computer, on your laptop, you can run through the labs with me, and I'll show you how to implement tests, how to set up projects in using the project management tools, and also run through some of the developer scenarios. So thank you so much for attending the session. I hope you have a great evening, and looking forward to seeing you tomorrow.